Trump was like the most, in my mind, on that question, the most genocidal of the three was Trump. He says, for one, he dehumanized Palestinians by using it as a slur against Joe Biden. You're a Palestinian. You're a bad Palestinian. Just like so dehumanizing them, and then on top of that, saying it was he admitted that it was Israel who is not the ones. The Israel's not accepting the deals. Israel's not the one who wants to end the war.
Kennedy did. No, right, Trump did. You mean?
Yeah, Trump admitted that. Because Biden said, everybody's accepted this deal. It's just up to Hamas. And then Trump's like, no, that's not true. Israel's not accepting the deal. And they shouldn't. They should go in there and finish the job. He sounded like Nikki Haley. So Trump was like the most Nikki Haley genocidal sounding. Biden at least worked in a little bit of humanity by saying, I don't want to give them 2,000-pound bombs that they're going to use in populated areas that are going to kill a lot of civilians. And then Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s answer was the least genocidal to me in that he says, we should just be bringing in all of these leaders to have these discussions and working it out using diplomacy.
I mean, the problem is that whatever he says in the debate stage, we know that RFK Jr. has said, for example, every Palestinian dreams of killing a Jew.
That is the ideology that Gaza teaches children from when they're born, when they're toddlers. But they're taught that the highest aspiration of a Palestinian is to slit the throat of a Jew. They're taught that from when they're little babies.
And they're the most pampered people on earth. And we know he has a deeply genocidal worldview. So,
well, I don't know if it's genocidal, but I don't know if I've heard him say things.
What I just described, I would call deeply racist. And that I would say that the willingness to kill tens of thousands of Palestinians is foundationally premised on that racism, which RFK Jr. has had in spades and is refusing to relinquish despite being pressed by a lot of good faith actors on why he feels that way.
Yeah, I do think that his viewpoint of saying things like they're the most pampered people, or I don't believe there's a genocide going on there, or that, the Palestinians just want to kill all the Jews and there would be a genocide of Jews. He spews very much the Zionist pro-Israel talking points that we see circulating all throughout social media without actually doing the research and looking at the data, and instead just spewing the talking points that he's just been fed. But I don't know, at the end of the day, for example, in March, he did a podcast where he had a pro-Palestinian person and a pro-Israel person. Excuse me. He had back in March a podcast with a pro-Palestinian and a pro-Israel person, and he kind of moderated the discussion and had them actually have a very productive conversation. And he was willing to have that conversation. I think he's willing. I think, what I've kind of deduced from watching him in the debate was he definitely will spew the Israeli talking points. I'm uncomfortable with that. But I don't think he's willing to go along. It doesn't sound like he would sign off on 2,000-pound bombs or sign off on tons of weapons to Israel. I do think he would say, let's try to use diplomacy and talk this out.
Kim, I mean, even with the example you're describing, Joe Biden, who is the one administering the current genocide that's happening right now, also is not signing off on 2,000-pound bombs. I mean, to be clear, 2,000-pound bombs have already devastated Gaza, right? So what? RFK Jr. is going to be equally as genocidal as Joe Biden? That's not exactly a relief.
I think he'd be less. I think it wouldn't be. I don't think any of the three. Well, I just think from the fact that he says that he would, for one, his stance on Ukraine and Russia, that war in particular, he's open to having conversations with world leaders. I think he would bring in other world leaders and have conversations about Israel-Palestine. So he's at least a step further than Joe Biden in wanting to have these conversations, wanting to open up the door to talks with Iran, with Russia, with China. That if you get those guys in the room, they're not going to say it's okay to commit this genocide. Those world leaders are going to sit them down and look them in the face and say, you realize your country is aiding and abetting a genocide that's happening.
But those countries already don't want, to the extent that they don't want there to be a genocide, what's preventing them from stopping the genocide is U.S. diplomatic cover at the United Nations, America's choice to continue its aid to Israel, regardless of whether or not it cherry picks this one weapon to not send over there, to continuously thwart ceasefire resolutions when they finally do pass the UN by doing this whole fiction of a ceasefire deal that Netanyahu agrees with, right? This is what Sam Husseini has been really pushing, that by saying, oh, no, we've got a ceasefire deal now, the United States intervened and distracted from countries fulfilling the UN's obligation, their obligations under the UN to actually stop to have a ceasefire. So all that being said, at the end of the day, it's America. And you can say, well, I'm willing to sit down with people. And this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, Kim, I got to say. There is a certain cohort of like the independent, right-leaning crowd that really do use this idea that like, I'm willing to have a conversation. I'm open to sit down with the people who disagree with me. I'm willing to do a free speech. As though that is and of itself the decision-making that we want to see, or the moral shift that we want to see, or the political shift that we want to see, when it's just a cover for their unwillingness to do anything other than what the Republican establishment blob has been pushing on this foreign policy issue, and the Democratic establishment blob, to be clear, on Israel since time immemorial.
Well, you have to have the conversation first. I mean, you got to start there, so at least, right? So that does have to happen. But then you're right; it has to be actually followed up with policy. So what confidence do you have? What evidence do you have, or why do you have any confidence that RFK Jr. isn't just using this as a kind of rhetorical shield to say, sure, I'm willing to talk about it, when everything in terms of who he's surrounded himself with, he's brought in Rabbi Shmuley, he pushed out his old campaign manager, Dennis Kucinich, who's very principled on this issue. Right? You know, aren't his actions demonstrating, and in addition to his Islamophobic, anti-Arab rhetoric, that he is very clear on how he would continue to litigate the conflict in the region? I think that the point that he has in his favor that Joe Biden doesn't have is that he is, when it comes to other conflicts, I think his position is better. His position is more in line actually with Trump when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, and understanding the background of that conflict, understanding how we end that conflict. I think both RFK Jr. and Trump have the same sort of stance on that. And that's, in my opinion, a better stance to have than what Joe Biden has.
Remembers it was a good one. You say you want to negotiate with Putin. What if Putin says, just let us keep the territory we have and don't have Ukraine join NATO? Acceptable?
That is Putin's, right now, his opening bargaining position. Putin has been asking to settle this war from the beginning. In fact, he agreed to 2 separate treaties, the Minsk Accords, in 2019, which Zelensky ran in 2019 and ran promising to sign the Minsk Accords. And really the only thing Putin wanted was to keep NATO out of the Ukraine. He then, in 2022, right after he first invaded with only 40,000 troops, when President Biden said there is absolute baloney, President Putin did not go into Ukraine intending to conquer Europe. He only sent 40,000 troops. It's a nation of 44 million people. He didn't even want to take Ukraine. He wanted us back at the negotiating table. Zelensky asked the United States to help him negotiate a treaty with Putin. And Biden administration said no. Zelensky then went and asked Israel, and Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister, said yes, and Erdogan in Turkey said yes, and they negotiated a beautiful treaty in Istanbul in April of 2022. They signed the treaty. The one thing that Putin wanted was that we didn't put NATO in Ukraine. He didn't want to conquer Europe. And they signed it. Putin was withdrawing his troops, leaving Donbass and Lugansk. And what happened? President Joe Biden sent Boris Johnson over to Kiev and forced Zelensky to tear up that agreement because they had another agenda, which is to weaken Russia. President Trump was part of it. President Trump gave the first $1.3 billion to Ukraine in 2017 of the first offensive weapons. He then sent Mike Pompeo over there in 2019 to say that we're going to put NATO there. So, and then he walked away from the intermediate range nuclear treaty with Russia unilaterally. We had a nuclear weapons treaty that we wouldn't put intermediate missiles in Ukraine or the other former Soviet satellite states. And President Trump walked away from it. So the two of them are equally culpable in the provocations that led to this war. And I'm not excusing Putin. Putin didn't need to go into Ukraine. And he should be held responsible too. We need to look at our responsibility, and it falls both on the backs of President Trump and President Biden.
Which is just continue the war and give everything to Ukraine, to fight Russia.
Can we actually go to the Russia-Ukraine debate clip?
I will have that war settled between Putin and Zelensky as president-elect before I take office on January 20th. I'll have that war settled. People being killed so needlessly, so stupidly, and I will get it settled, and I'll get it settled fast before I take office.
President Biden, you have a minute.
The fact is that Putin is a war criminal. He's killed thousands and thousands of people. And he has made one thing clear. He wants to reestablish what was part of the Soviet Empire, not just a piece. He wants all of Ukraine. That's what he wants. And then you think he'll stop?
Because I actually felt like that was an under-discussed moment in the debate. Yeah. And I might push back against you a little bit, Kim. I felt like, fascinatingly, Trump came out well ahead of Biden on that. And the liberal punditry that's so concerned with the optics of it, understandably so, also missed the extent to which Trump really, I think, bested Biden on this in terms of using the kind of language that has been really resonating with the anti-war right and left, which is to say, this is a war that should have never started. The harder question to answer is, how do you wrap it up now? Whether or not you agree with Ukraine having to get up this much territory or what have you, like those are the kind of debates that I think even anti-war people struggle with. But what Trump really said, and what I think gained him a lot of points with a normal non-Beltway audience, is to say, this is a war that never should have begun. This is a war that was about NATO expansion that contravene promises that were made that would not happen. And this is basically Biden's fault. This is America's fault.
Right. And Kennedy has that exact same viewpoint, that this is a war that never should have started, that this was NATO expansion, that we have to, that he said it's existential for Russia. They've been invaded through Ukraine 3 or 4 times. They cannot allow Ukraine to go into the hands of NATO when it's pivotal to their national security. And unless we understand that, we won't understand this conflict. We won't understand that Russia cannot afford to lose this. They will continue fighting because they literally cannot afford it with having been invaded through Ukraine as many times as they have. So Kennedy's position on that is the same as Trump's. Where Kennedy differs is he's not using Nikki Haley language when it comes to Israel. And look, I already know Trump's record when it comes to Israel. I don't know. Kennedy, I get it. He's got Shmuley there. He's saying a lot of things. But if I had to choose between the two on that one issue of Israel, I would gamble on Kennedy more than I would on Trump, because I've already seen Trump's record. I already saw him move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I already saw him legalize the illegal settlements in the West Bank. He legitimized those illegal settlements. I already saw him legitimize the annexing of the Golan Heights, Syrian territory, to Israel. I've already seen him.
Why is that the choice? Why is it? Why are you framing it between? The choice,
well, because it is. I mean, if it weren't, Jill Stein is my preferred candidate, and I would like everybody to like Jill Stein. The reality of the situation at this point is she's not growing enough in the polls for her to actually be a viable candidate. I mean, many of us can continue talking about her.
Kim, I think that talking like that is precisely the problem. There's this collective fear of failure. This I call it a kind of loser syndrome that developed after Bernie's losses on the left, where people are unwilling to, I think it's infinitely more brave and infinitely harder to say that people should vote for the candidate they actually believe in, especially in the shadow of a genocide, than to just say, well, yeah, this guy's polling the most. We can all see that RFK Jr. is polling the most.
Right.
But first of all, he's not going to win either. So why would we telegraph to ostensibly the most left party, the Democratic Party, that what it needs to do is move more toward RFK Jr. as opposed to move more toward our Jill Stein if they want our votes back, if they ever want a chance of winning again, right? I'm not saying that that's why we're voting for Jill Stein or that's the ultimate goal, but to the extent that that might be an effect, isn't that what we want to be telegraphing?
Well, sure. She's not a Democrat, though, so they're not going to care or listen, right? She's running on the Green Party ticket, so they're not.
RFK Jr.
Well, but he was,
He's an independent.
but no, I mean, he's a Democrat. I mean, he's running as an independent. No, he's a Democrat. He's totally a Democrat. He's running as an independent because the Democratic Party pushed him out. Otherwise, he'd be a Democrat. I mean, I talked to him about this extensively. I mean, I will take the credit. I'm going to take the credit. I do think that the reason why he became an independent was because I pressed him on it. I mean, everybody was like, finally, somebody told him, why the hell are you running as a Democrat? They're never going to let you in the debates. They're never going to let you on the ticket. It's just not going to happen, buddy. You should run as an independent. He sat there and said, I can't believe you're telling me this. I'm a Democrat. I want to bring the Democratic Party back to the days of Kennedy Democrats. He's so, just like Dennis Kucinich, so thoroughly a Democrat, they cannot break themselves away, really. Strategically, he's running as an independent.
But the point you're making isn't an ideological one, right? The point is that, well, Jill Stein's not a Democrat, so she's not going to be listened to by the Democratic Party. Jill Stein's not a Democrat, so they're not going to care about, she's not going to have any influence or she's not going to be able to win. Well, for those reasons, Jill Stein and RFK Jr. are in the same place because RFK Jr. is who he is and has the beliefs that he believes and has been, I don't mean this judgmentally, but courting the audience that he's been courting. The Democratic Party loathes him, is not going to listen to him, and is not going to have any takeaways from his success other than they already, Kennedy aside, are eager to move right on a number of issues because that's where they think the electorate is. And more importantly, actually, that's where they know their donor base is. So I'm just confused about this. That's not my concern. Like to the extent that like there's resistance to the Democratic Party to change, that is true regardless on the basis of like the political affiliations of RFK Jr. and Jill Stein respectively. What I'm more concerned with is the directionality of the influence that they have.
But what did it, I mean, did the Democratic Party change at all after Bernie? I mean, was there any, I mean,
there were changes to the platform for sure. But I mean, to be clear, I want to build a third party. That's why another reason why I think it's so much more important to support Jill Stein or even Jill Stein over Cornel West, who I respect so greatly, because my interest is not in the candidate, but in actually building a party structure, getting them, $20 million of federal funding that they can get if they hit 5% of the vote by voting for someone who actually stands for what I believe in and can start building a party infrastructure and continue to build a party infrastructure across the country that can elect people all the way down ballot.
I think if your primary concern or goal is a third party, then you'd vote Kennedy. You'd have to. That's the only person who's actually going to break the duopoly. Jill Stein's not going to break that duopoly.
My primary concern isn't voting a third party. I don't want to vote for a genocidal maniac.
No, right. But you want to break a duopoly, right? You want to break the duopoly. Well, the only person who's really got a viable shot at breaking that duopoly at this point is Kennedy. Jill Stein doesn't have that.
He doesn't have a party.
He doesn't. I mean, it doesn't matter.
He doesn't have a party.
You don't have to have a party.
It does matter. You have to build a party to have a permanent impact on whether or not you actually are able to have.
He could later.
Like Bernie Sanders?
Like Bernie Sanders should have done. Bernie should have done.
But my point is that these candidates, they run these candidacies. They clearly have no interest in party development or doing anything outside of themselves. Haven't we learned that lesson already? And shouldn't we be invested in a party infrastructure over? It's not about Jill Stein as a human being, who I happen to like a great deal and respect a great deal. But it's about the party. At what point are we going to learn this lesson and stop investing in these heroic? Why not?
Because it's just too one-sided. I mean, in order to build, it's too far left. I mean, the Green Party is just never going to attract on many issues. Practically all of them. Jill Stein is not, though. Jill Stein as a candidate is actually quite populist. Jill Stein is incredibly populist as a candidate. And she disagrees with her party all the time because the party has, very leftist positions that is just, they're not going to attract the populist middle.
There's
or even
disagreements within the Republican Party. There's disagreements within the Democratic Party. Most of the Republican Party thinks that You should give every last dollar in every American's bank account to Ukraine and litigate the war to the very end. Most of the Republican Party believes in a whole bunch of things that are not part of the populist wing that independents want to pretend that the Republican Party really is. The Republican Party isn't, Massey and Ron Paul. Like, that's just a fringe component. The same way that there's a lot of diversity within the Democratic Party. The point is, though, that on a very basic level, the Green Party adopts all of the populist frameworks that we say that we care about as people who formally supported Bernie Sanders, right? Really basic bedrock issues like Medicare for all, which 69% of voters of Americans still wanting to have these greater labor protections, wanting the environment not to burn up into a crisp. I mean, it's not like a rocket science issue, right? Like, this isn't a close one in terms of which one of these parties, and I say that again, understanding that RFK Jr. doesn't have a party, which one of these parties actually represents the interests of most Americans?
The Green Party doesn't. I mean, it would be way more popular if it did. If anything, the Libertarian Party has a better shot at breaking through, in the existing parties that are out there that are already kind of growing and popular. The Libertarian Party has a greater shot at becoming that third party potential. I mean, but they've got their own ideological problems that people are uncomfortable with. The fact that what is the ideology other than no government for anything?
They don't want a government, exactly.
Right. Yeah. So that's that. But that allows a lot of room for a lot of different ideas. That's why you have a Chase Oliver, for example, who's now the nominee for the Libertarian Party. I get it. There's a lot of strife there, but Chase Oliver is somebody who comes from the Democratic side. He's a leftist libertarian. And the libertarians have accepted him. So as the Libertarian Party actually has more room for people to be left and right.
I don't think he's a leftist libertarian. I don't mean this any disrespect to Chase Oliver, but I don't think he would describe himself as a leftist libertarian.
No, he does.
He's a former Obama voter who also happens to be gay and is also a libertarian. But let's not do the Richie Torres thing where, you're gay, so you're left somehow. Like,
I think he would say that his policies are that he is more liberal. He is a liberal, but he's a libertarian. He just
liberal on what? Social issues?
Social issues, like, for sure, yeah.
But that's what it means to be a libertarian. That's what I mean, like, happens to be gay. Like, I appreciate it. Like, I love a not a bigot, but that is not what it means to be a leftist. Liberals love identity politics. Liberals love to put a gay flag on a missile and drop it on a refugee camp.
Yeah, the Green Party is too authoritarian for populism. The Green Party is not at all populist. There's nothing populist about the Green Party. The Green Party is full-on authoritarian. And that is where Jill Stein and I have had conversations about that authoritarianism, and she differs from the party on those particular points of wanting to control. They're big on right. In order to solve all the problems that the Green Party cares about, you have to do a lot of massive control of the populations. It's just not popular. That is why the Libertarian Party is growing faster than the Green Party at this point, because people are wanting less government control, less government intervention. And so libertarians have been able to soak up more of the populists than Green Party candidates the Green Party has been able to do. But neither of those parties are really going to break the duopoly, because they are viewed as fringe by the vast majority of the voters. So even if people like myself, who I tend to agree a lot with libertarians, but I would never call myself a libertarian because I don't believe in no government. I believe you have to have some rules and regulations in order to make things fair and consistent. I think that if you have no government and no rules, then you do end up with corporations running amok and gaining all the power. And how do you got to do something to correct that. And it's never been tried. We've never seen a libertarian example in the world at all ever working.
Well, we're watching Argentina crash and burn right now under Javier Milei.
Well, maybe it's still too early to tell.
All right. Well, we'll see how this 300% inflation goes. But
for the first time in many years, they just had no inflation increase for the first time. That just happened.
We can agree to disagree, but I just got to say this for the sake of this podcast and my listeners, because I believe that we are creating the world that we want to build.
Yeah.
The Green Party is going to break the duopoly. You have to invest in something and build something if you want it to actually work. and your values actually matter, and you should vote your values. And if everyone collectively who's listening to this podcast voted for the person who they actually thought was going to make their life better, end a genocide, and give them the basic protections that other similarly affluent countries have, who aren't nearly as affluent as the United States of America, you could be living in a better world. And the episode that you're going to listen to on Thursday that talks about how we need to have collective internationalist power in order to achieve our goals both here and abroad, and how all of this is connected with our banking systems and the like, really drive home how essential it is to have not just a party that breaks the duopoly, but one that does so along very specific ideological lines. Because what you don't want is to replace one corrupt corporate party that is invested in your immiseration with another. And with someone who is so openly genocidal as RFK Jr., who's literally talking about Palestinians being bred to wake up. We'll put the clip in because you won't, it is as bad as I'm describing it.
Yeah.
Bred to, dream of slaughtering Jews. That the idea that is, if you're going to ideologically like protest vote against Joe Biden, but vote for somebody like that because when there's a genocide going on, to me, it doesn't make any sense. I don't get it. I might as well vote for Joe Biden at that point, because on many things, because what the argument, so-and-so's not going to win. Well, fine. Joe Biden actually could win. And, if I don't care about the genocide of it all, then he might as well be there to, I don't know, appoint some Supreme Court justices that are going to be better than the other guy. Then we might as well be in a vote blue no matter who kind of realm.
Well, I think you're kind of going from one extreme to the other. So I think that what we have to identify is what is the biggest problem right now. And I understand the idea completely of voting your conscience, voting for somebody you agree with and you align with. I think people should be able to do that. We just, unfortunately, at this point, live in our current system is so broken and so corrupted that we have a duopoly that it is, I do think it's quite important to break that duopoly. It's like, for example, my family comes from Vietnam. Half of my family came here to the United States, but the other half were left behind in Vietnam and lived under communism for quite some time, for decades, before communism shifted and life got better for people in Vietnam. When you're living in a situation like that, you don't have the you do have the luxury. You can make a choice to care about the little things like litter, and that matters to people. I don't want to live in a world that's littered. I don't want smoking in the restaurants. There's like a lot of different laws that I feel like have made life better for me here. Like, I live in California, that makes it a cleaner, healthier, nicer place. But you know what? When you're worried about whether or not you're going to eat, when you're worried about if you're going to have an education, if you have a place to send your kids for schooling, or if they're going to be left out, if you're worried about whether or not you're going to die tomorrow from some sort of famine or or if you're being bombed in Gaza, right? You're not worried about whether or not your Starbucks cup is recyclable. Wthese are first world problems that we get to nitpick at.
But no one's talking about any of those things.
Yeah, but my point is that it would be if we were at the point. So we're in that, it's the same sort of mentality, but it's on a political level. So as you get more, as society gets better, as we can end up having first world problems. When you're living in communism, you don't have the luxury of first world problems. When you're living in Gaza, you don't have the luxury of first world problems.
Who's talking about first world problems? We're literally talking about Gaza.
Right, but the point is, you have to worry about the biggest issue in front of you and solve that. And you put all of your differences aside with everybody around you. All the Palestinians, whether they're Christian, whether they're Muslim, whatever their political, whether they support Hamas or they don't support Hamas, right? They don't have the luxury to think about all of those nuanced differences between them right now. They're worried about whether or not 2,000-pound bombs are going to drop from the sky. So they collectively, together, when I went over to the West Bank with a bunch of Christian Americans who are from Palestine, they have Palestinian heritage, they all, collectively, it was the sentiment with all of the Palestinians was, yeah, we have a lot of political differences and religious differences, but it doesn't matter. The only thing we really worry about is the occupation. They have one concern collectively together, and they put those differences aside in order to get rid of that one major, huge problem for them that is causing them to not be able to have their political differences and have their religious differences and worry about recyclable Starbucks cups, right? They can't do that. So we have a political crisis in this country right now. We have a duopoly that's run amok that is no longer democratic for the people, doesn't represent the people at all. So the main goal in our political life right now is the 2,000-pound bomb that is being dropped on us politically all the time. So we have to stop that bomb somehow. And then we can nitpick about all the other little things. And then you can separate into your parties and vote for that person that really, truly represents you, because we finally divided the duopoly and we're finally able to actually have those choices. What's the point of having those choices if those choices absolutely never matter? You know, it's like, what's the point of worrying about recycling when you're going to be blown up tomorrow and buried under a building? You can't. So you've got to worry about the big thing.
Tell me if I'm understanding this right. Tell me, push back. Tell me if I'm understanding this right. It sounds like what you're saying is you're drawing an analogy, making a metaphor about the number one crisis that's facing American voters being to break the duopoly, and analogizing that to the number one focus of Palestinians, Gazans, being that they're in the middle of a genocide.
Yeah, or people in communism, or people in poverty, or people
and that I'm going to leave the communism example for a second and just focus on those two if I can.
Sure.
So I do wonder if there's not a great deal of irony in the idea that we can understand for analogy purposes how important it is to resist a genocide. But the argument, and correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to be making is that it's worth ignoring that the guy that you think has the best chance of breaking the duopoly is, I would argue, the strongest, or, they're all maybe all tied for being extremely strong in supporting that very genocide. Do you see what I'm saying? You're acknowledging that's a really big thing, so much so that you're using it for the basis of an analogy, but also saying that shouldn't be a factor in choosing which one of the duopoly breakers we choose to put our vote behind.
Right. I'm using the analogy of the genocide not as a point of whether or not you support or you don't support whatever's going on over in Israel and Gaza. The people in Palestine have one concern and one concern only that overrides every other concern that they have, as they should. Because would it make sense for Palestinians to strife amongst one another inside of Palestine and squabble over politics or squabble over religion amongst themselves, keep the infighting going? That's exactly what Netanyahu's strategy was. In fact, his strategy was divide and conquer, and that has been quite effective. So it's better for Palestinians, it's better for all people when they're up against Goliath to put all of their differences aside, don't allow for the divide and conquer, and instead hyper-focus on the one thing that is going to liberate them. And that is what the Palestinians are starting to do more. I think now there's polls of who they support and who they rally behind now, and how certain people or groups have gained in popularity. And when you can focus yourselves rather than divide and conquer, rather than be divided so that the Goliath can always conquer, we have to get together and conquer Goliath. And that is a massive, massive feat. Goliath is huge, and we're just little David.
Right. So I don't disagree about uniting and conquering Goliath. I think that everyone should reunite behind the Green Party, the only left party that espouses our values, that is anti-genocide, all of the things in the United States of America. And to the extent that you feel like the party needs to change and grow, I think everyone agrees, Jill Stein would say that as well, then we should invest in it and do exactly that.
But it doesn't represent everybody. I mean, you could do that, but what will that do?
RFK Jr. does?
Well, he definitely represents more. I mean, the polls are there, the numbers are there. So he's representing more people. You have to, it's like when
Briahna. But wait a minute. And Joe Biden represents more, and Donald Trump represents more.
Right, but we're trying to break the duopoly. They're the Goliath.
Well, but no, I'm not interested in just randomly supporting someone who is going to continue literally the very worst thing that the duopoly is doing right now.
Right, I understand that. I understand, but the United States has a lot of this is, to me, the worst thing is to support a genocide. It's definitely the worst thing that our country is doing. We've done a lot of really horrible, horrific things, and there will be more. This won't be the last. I mean, look, I could care, and I do. Everybody knows I care a lot about what's going on with the Palestinians and what's going on in Israel. I talk about it ad nauseum, and I've been called an anti-Semite more times than I can count just before I even woke up this morning. But this isn't the last one. I mean, So
Is
I
a
think
reason maybe to want someone who has a consistent ideological basis on which to address these kinds of things that's going to make sure they're going to come out on the right side of these issues again and again and again over time, right? Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.